Ever feel like, history is just like a broken record? The same mistakes happening over and over again. Well, the Book of Judges, it takes that idea and like turns it up to 11.
Yeah, it's really a book that people don't talk about as much as some of the others.
Right.
But it's got all this drama and, intrigue, and it's like surprisingly relevant to us even, today.
Yeah, and the Book of Judges picks up right after the whole Joshua leading the Israelites into the Promised Land thing, right?
Yeah.
So they've just had this huge victory, but they're given this very specific task.
Right.
They're supposed to drive out the Canaanites completely
Okay.
to avoid being like influenced by their, practices and beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens? What goes wrong?
Well, you basically just said it.
Wow.
They're supposed to drive them out.
Right.
And they don't.
But
They
right.
start making compromises, making treaties, even adopting the Canaanite gods.
Oh, wow.
It's like they totally forget everything they've learned about, God's faithfulness and the dangers of all that idolatry stuff.
So they disobey. They make some bad choices.
Mm.
Does God just give up on them at that point?
No, not at all. And that's where these judges come in. But it's important to understand that a judge, back then, it wasn't like what we think of today.
Right.
These aren't people in robes, making legal decisions or whatever. They're more like tribal leaders, military heroes, even prophets sometimes.
So they're these divinely appointed leaders who come up, during times of crisis.
Exactly.
Okay.
They're the ones who rally the Israelites, deliver them from their enemies and try to get them, back on their right path.
Okay.
But here's the thing. These judges are far from perfect.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, they're flawed. They're complex. They make some pretty questionable choices themselves sometimes.
That's interesting because it kind of changes how we usually think of these biblical heroes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It makes me think like, what's the point of these flawed leaders? Why would God work through them?
It's a great question, and it kind of points to something deep about God, He doesn't just sit around waiting for us to be perfect before he can use us,
Right.
He meets us right where we are in all our mess and empowers us and accomplishes what he wants, even with all our, shortcomings.
But wouldn't it just be easier, if he picked, leaders who were already perfect and morally upright?
Maybe, but think about what kind of message that would send,
Yeah. Yeah.
If only perfect people could do God's work, what does that say about everyone else?
Yeah.
The Book of Judges is really about how God is willing to work with anyone who is willing to be used.
That's a powerful message.
Yeah.
So we've got these flawed leaders, the judges, rising up and delivering the Israelites.
Yeah.
But it sounds like there's this pattern, this cycle that just keeps repeating.
You got it. And this cycle is like the key to understanding the whole book.
Okay.
It goes like this. The Israelites stray from God.
Right.
They get oppressed.
Right.
They cry out for help.
Mm-hmm.
God raises up a judge. They get delivered. They have some peace. And then they forget God and the whole thing starts all over again.
It's like they never learn.
Yeah.
Does that, does that sound familiar to you?
Oh, yeah.
Like in your own life or even, in history?
Yeah.
How things happen?
Absolutely. I think this cycle, it shows how we all struggle as humans. We forget what we learned in the past,
Right.
We make the same mistakes even when we know better. And the consequences, well, as you see in Judges, they can be really bad.
Yeah, so the book really shows how humans mess up,
Mm-hmm.
but there are specific judges that we're supposed to focus on, right?
Right.
There's Othniel, Ehud, Deborah,
Right.
Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson.
Yeah, those are the 6 main ones. And their stories, they aren't just random episodes.
Right.
They actually form a progression. Each judge is more flawed than the last one.
Oh, wow.
And it shows what happens, when those flaws get out of control.
So let's start with Gideon.
Okay.
He's the one who starts out, full of doubt, but ends up defeating a whole army with just a few men, right?
That's him. He's hesitant at first, unsure of himself and God's plan, but God reassures him, empowers him, and Gideon leads the Israelites to victory against all odds.
So real underdog story.
Yeah.
But wait, you said the judges get more flawed as we go, so what happens with Gideon?
Well, even with his victories, Gideon falls prey to the same stuff that was messing up the Israelites in the first place.
Okay.
They make some bad choices driven by pride and wanting glory for himself.
Like what? What did he do?
For example, after his victory, Gideon uses the spoils of war to make an ephod.
Okay.
That's like a priestly garment.
Right.
And it might seem like just a way of showing devotion, but it quickly becomes something the Israelites start worshiping,
Oh, no.
which leads them right back into idolatry.
Wow. So even someone who starts out faithful and humble can be tempted like that.
Yeah.
His victory almost became his downfall.
Yeah, it's a warning for sure.
Yeah,
Gideon's story reminds us that even when we win, we need to stay focused,
right.
grounded in our faith, and careful not to let pride or ambition, lead us astray.
Makes you think, how do we protect ourselves from those same traps if someone like Gideon can fall into them?
It's a good question to think about, and it becomes even more important as we look at the stories of the later judges like Jephthah and Samson.
Right.
Their flaws are much bigger, and the consequences, well, they get really tragic, but we'll save those stories for next time.
Okay, yeah.
Welcome back. Ready for more judges?
Yeah, I'm ready. We left off talking about how the judges get more and more flawed as we go through the book.
Right, and Jephthah is a perfect example of that.
Okay.
And remember, we're not saying these guys are perfect role models.
Right.
We're looking at them as people, complex people God used even though they weren't perfect.
Gotcha. So tell me about Jephthah. What was wrong with him?
Well, Jephthah starts out as an outcast, but then he becomes important when the Israelites are threatened by the Ammonites.
Okay.
He really wants to win, so he makes this rash promise to God. He says, "If you give me victory over the Ammonites, whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return, I will offer it up as a burnt offering."
Oh, I think I know where this is going.
Yeah, it's not good.
This can't be good.
Jephthah wins the battle. He goes back home all happy, and who comes out to greet him but his own daughter dancing and playing her tambourine?
Oh, man. That's just awful.
Yeah.
I mean, I get that Jephthah was trying to be, devoted to God, but did God really want that kind of sacrifice?
That's a tough question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one that people have been arguing about for centuries.
Really?
Yeah, some people say that Jephthah was really sorry about his promise and that the point of the story is how sad it is.
But he still did it.
He did, and this story makes us think about some really hard things.
Yeah.
Like what vows mean, what God is really like, and what happens when we misunderstand our faith.
Definitely makes you stop and think. So if Jephthah's problem was being rash and too zealous, what about Samson? What's his story?
Samson is probably the most famous judge and maybe the most flawed, too.
Right.
He's got the superhuman strength, but he's also driven by passion, impulsiveness, and he's got a thing for Philistine women.
Wait, the Philistines, those are the Israelites' enemies, right?
Exactly.
So he's got this amazing gift from God, all this potential, but he kind of wastes it.
Yeah, he's always getting involved with Philistine women, breaking promises and acting out of revenge instead of, doing what's right.
There's that whole thing with Delilah, right?
Oh, yeah.
She tricks him into telling her the secret of his strength.
Right, she cuts off his hair and he loses all his power.
It's like the classic story of temptation and betrayal, but
Yeah.
what's the bigger picture here? What's Samson's story really about?
I think it's about what happens when you let your desires control you.
Okay.
Samson lets his desires run wild and he loses everything, his strength, his freedom, even his eyesight.
What a sad ending. He starts out with so much promise, but his bad choices ruin him. I guess it shows that even with God's help, we can still mess up if we're not careful.
It's a powerful warning, but even in Samson's story, there's a bit of redemption.
Oh, really?
Yeah, at the very end, when he's captured and blinded by the Philistines, he prays to God one last time and brings the whole temple down, killing himself and all his enemies.
So even in his last moments, Samson is still doing his job as a judge, saving the Israelites from their enemies.
It's a complicated ending, but it does seem to say that even when we fail, God can still use us.
We've covered a lot. The Israelites not driving out the Canaanites, the flawed judges. It seems like they just keep getting worse and worse as the book goes on.
Yeah, and that leads us to the last part of Judges, which shows a society that's basically falling apart.
Okay.
The source material says these last chapters are not for the faint of heart.
Oh, boy.
Ready to go there.
Yeah, let's do it. I have a feeling it's going to get even darker. Okay, so we've been looking at how the book of Judges is all about this cycle of disobedience and what happens because of it.
Right.
But it feels like things are about to get even worse. What's coming up next?
Well, we're getting to the darkest part of the whole book.
Oh,
It's full of stories about violence, idolatry, and just moral decay. The source material calls it hitting rock bottom, like as a whole society.
That sounds intense. What kind of stories show this whole collapse happening?
Well, there's this story about Micah and his idol.
Yeah.
It shows how idolatry was spreading, which is like the opposite of what God wanted.
Right.
Micah makes his own shrine with a carved image, basically making up his own religion.
So it's like the total opposite of what the Israelites were supposed to be doing, right?
Exactly. The whole thing was about worshiping only the one true God.
Right.
But at this point, nobody seems to care about God's law or, even being good to other people.
So how does that story about Micah fit into this whole society falling apart thing.
Well, what Micah does starts this whole chain reaction of chaos.
Oh, wow.
Some guys from the tribe of Dan come along and steal his idol, and then they attack a peaceful city, killing everyone and taking their land.
It's like the violence just spreads. They're acting just like the people they were supposed to be different from.
Yeah, and it just keeps getting worse until you get to probably the most disturbing story in the whole book.
Okay.
It's about a Levite and his concubine who are traveling through the area where the tribe of Benjamin lives.
That's the one that starts a civil war, right? With the sexual assault.
Yeah, the Levite and his concubine, they're looking for a place to stay for the night.
Okay.
But then this mob of Benjaminite men surrounds the house and they want to attack the Levite.
Oh, no.
So to protect himself, he sends his concubine out to them.
That's horrible.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine how awful that is.
It's a terrible act of violence, and it shows how far the Israelites have fallen from, justice and righteousness.
So what happens after that?
Well, the concubine is raped and left to die, and then the Levite does something shocking.
Why?
He cuts up her body and sends the pieces to the other tribes as a way of saying, you need to do something about this.
Oh, my God.
And that starts a huge civil war between the Benjaminites and the other 11 tribes.
So the whole nation is tearing itself apart. It's like all their disobedience is finally caught up with them.
Yeah, it does feel that way. The book ends with this feeling of hopelessness, like everything has gone wrong.
But you mentioned earlier that there's some hope, right?
Yeah.
Something about that line, in those days, Israel had no king.
Exactly. That line keeps popping up throughout the book, and it points to a bigger problem.
Okay.
The fact that they didn't have one leader, one king, that's part of why everything fell apart.
So it's not just that there wasn't a king, it's that not having a king had consequences.
Exactly. They needed someone to lead them, someone to hold them accountable, to bring them back to God.
And that's how the book of Judges ends.
Yeah, it doesn't have a happy ending or a clear solution.
Mhm.
It ends with this feeling of longing, like they need something more.
Almost like it's not over yet.
In a way, it's not. That's what's cool about the Bible.
Yeah.
It's all connected. The book of Judges, it leads into the next books like Ruth and 1 Samuel.
Okay.
Those tell the stories of David and how the monarchy started in Israel.
So even though Judges ends on a sad note, it's not really the end. It's more like a bridge to something new.
Right? It reminds us that even when things are really bad, God is still working.
Right.
The story of Israel, it's like our own stories, ups and downs, good times and bad times.
This has been quite a journey. We've seen the cycle of sin, the consequences of disobedience, and how flawed leaders can mess things up.
Yeah.
But we've also seen how faithful God is and how he can work through anyone, even if they're not perfect.
Yeah.
What's the one thing you want our listener to take away from this deep dive into Judges?
I hope they'll remember that Judges isn't just some old history lesson.
Okay.
It's like a mirror showing us how we tend to make the same mistakes over and over.
Yeah.
And just like the Israelites wanted a good king, we also want someone to lead us, redeem us, and bring us back to God.
Maybe, just maybe, the book of Judges can help us see those bad cycles in our own lives
Right.
and help us break free,
Yeah.
search for wisdom and guidance, and in the end, a closer relationship with God.
Exactly.